crazy woman. You think you can take our brother's properties? We will not allow you.
My name is Justina, and this is my true life story. I need you to understand something before I tell you this story. I was not a weak woman. I had never been weak. Victor knew that when he married me. His family knew it too. But grief has a way of making people think they can take advantage of you. And the moment my husband closed his eyes for the last time, his family decided that the woman who had stood by his side for 11 years was suddenly their enemy. It was a Tuesday morning when Victor complained of chest pain. I told him to rest. I made him ginger tea the way his mother had taught me, placed a warm cloth on his chest and sat beside him on the bed. I held his hand. I told him he was going to be fine. By noon, he was gone. The doctor said it was cardiac arrest. He was 41 years old. My husband, the man who used to sing off-key in the kitchen and still expected me to clap for him, was gone. I did not even have time to cry properly. By evening, the compound was full. Relatives I had not seen in years arrived with their bags and their loud voices and their eyes that swept across everything Victor and I owned. I noticed it immediately. The way they looked at the television, at the chairs, at the land papers hanging on the wall in the parlor. They were not looking at me with sympathy. They were looking at everything with calculation. I have always had a good relationship with my husband's family. His brothers and relatives respected me. I have always said I will never marry into a family that does not accept me. But I was shocked with the way they switched after Victor passed. Victor's eldest brother, Emmanuel, arrived last. He was a big man, both in body and in the way he carried himself, like the world owed him something. He walked into our home without greeting me. He sat in Victor's chair, the chair my husband had bought when we finally got our first big contract, and he crossed his legs and looked around like a man surveying what he already owned. I should have run that night. Instead, I went to the kitchen to cook for the guests because that was what a good widow was supposed to do. I cooked jollof rice and fried fish and pepper soup, and I served everyone, and I cried quietly in the kitchen where no one could see me, wiping my tears with the edge of my wrapper before carrying the next tray out. That night, Emmanuel called a family meeting in my own parlor. He sat at the head of the table and spoke like a chairman. I was not invited to sit with them. I stood at the doorway of my own house like a visitor, holding my daughter Chisom's hand while my son Emeka pressed himself against my side. Emmanuel cleared his throat and said, "We need to talk about what happened to our brother." I said, "Your brother died of a heart attack. The hospital confirmed it." He looked at me with eyes that were absolutely cold and said, "That is what they want us to believe." The room went quiet. I felt the air change. And that was the moment I understood that nothing was ever going to be the same again. They called me a witch before the week of mourning was over. Not in whispers, openly. Emmanuel stood in front of the gathered family on the 4th day and announced that I had killed his brother for money. He said I had used my connections to poison Victor slowly. He said I had grown too ambitious, that I had wanted to control the properties and the business alone, and so I had removed Victor from the picture. I stood there and listened to this man accuse me of murdering my own husband, the man whose children I carried in my body, the man I had struggled with through years of hunger and hustle, and I could not find my voice. The shock was like a physical slap. Victor's mother, Mama Eke, was sitting in the corner, and I looked at her for help. We had always had a good relationship. She used to call me her daughter. She used to say I was better than any daughter she could have chosen herself. But that morning, she looked away from me. She pulled her wrapper tighter around her shoulders and looked away. That was when I knew I was completely alone. They brought in an old woman from their village the next morning. I did not know what they had told her, but she came in with red chalk and some leaves and began performing what they called a cleansing of the compound. She waved things around my body and declared loudly that the spirit of the dead husband was crying because his wife had betrayed him. Then Emmanuel's wife, a woman named Gloria, who had never hidden her dislike of me, grabbed my arm and pulled me outside. Several women were waiting. They held me down. They shaved my head. I screamed. I fought. I told them to remove their hands from me. But there were too many of them, and I was already weakened by grief and 3 nights of not sleeping properly. They shaved my head clean while a crowd of neighbors watched from the fence. Some recorded it on their phones. Some said nothing. A few women shook their heads but did not step forward to help. When it was done, they put an old black mourning cloth on me and told me I was to sit on the floor for the rest of the mourning period as punishment for what I had done to their son. I sat. Not because I accepted their lies. I sat because I was planning. They took my phone first, then they went through the house and began removing things: the television, the generator, the jewelry in my drawer, the envelope of cash I kept at the back of the wardrobe. Gloria wore my gold chain to dinner that same evening and smiled at me across the room. When I demanded my children be allowed to stay with me in the room, Emmanuel told me that Chisom and Emeka were now wards of the Eke family and would be raised properly without the influence of a woman who had murdered their father. They took my children. My daughter cried and reached for me as Gloria carried her away, and that sound, that single cry of "Mommy," is something that lives in my chest to this day, like a hot coal that never goes out. But I want you to hear me clearly. The moment they took my children was the moment the grieving widow died. What was left behind was something else entirely, something patient and sharp and very, very dangerous. If you've been following this story and it's touching your heart, please subscribe before we go further, because what happens next is the part that changes everything, and you don't want to miss it. They made me leave my own house on the 8th day. Emmanuel stood at the gate with 2 of his cousins and told me the property had been transferred to the family name, pending investigation. He handed me a small bag, the one he had packed himself, containing 2 wrappers, 1 pair of shoes, and nothing else, and he told me to go back to my father's house. I took the bag. I walked out of the gate. I did not cry where they could see me. I walked 2 streets down to the home of my neighbor and church member, Auntie Patience. She was a retired civil servant, a quiet woman who had seen everything in that neighborhood for 30 years. She opened her door before I even knocked, pulled me inside, and held me while I finally broke down. I cried until I had nothing left. Then I sat up, dried my face, and said, "Auntie Patience, I need your help." She said, "I have been waiting for you to ask." Auntie Patience was the one who helped me get a new SIM card using her own name because mine was registered to a phone they had taken. She was the one who walked with me to the police station, where we filed a formal complaint about the forcible removal of my property and the taking of my children. The officer who attended to us was a woman, and when I told her they had shaved my head in public, her expression shifted from professional to something much colder and more useful. She said, "We will look into this." I said, "Please, look quickly. My children are in that house." But I knew the police alone would not be enough. Emmanuel had connections. He knew people. Victor had always said his brother spent more time building relationships with powerful men than building any actual business. So I needed something stronger than a police report. I needed evidence. I went back to the beginning. Every document Victor and I had ever signed, I had copies of. Not in that house, but in a small metal box I had kept at Auntie Patience's home since the year someone broke into our office. Victor had laughed at me for being too careful. I thanked him silently now. The land documents were in my name and Victor's, jointly owned. The business registration papers listed both of us as directors. The vehicles were registered to our company, not to any individual. Emmanuel had taken a house he did not legally own and property that was never his to claim. But then I found something else. I had been going through Victor's old emails on a tablet they hadn't known existed. I had given it to Auntie Patience for safekeeping months earlier when Victor said he was buying a newer one. I was searching for anything useful, any correspondence about the properties, when I found an email thread between Victor and a man I didn't recognize. Victor had written, "I'm worried about Emmanuel. He asked me again about the land in the industrial area. I told him it's not for sale, but he won't let it go. He said some things that frightened me." The reply was from a lawyer friend of Victor's. "Be careful. Document everything. Some people will do anything when they believe they are owed something." That email was dated 6 weeks before Victor died. I sat in Auntie Patience's small sitting room with that tablet on my lap, and I felt the ground shift beneath me. A heart attack at 41, a brother who had been pressuring him about land, a family that moved too quickly and too confidently after his death, as though they had been prepared. I started to shake. Then I stopped shaking, because shaking would not get my children back. I needed to find out the truth about how Victor really died, and I was going to tear this thing open with my bare hands if I had to. I want to tell you something about fighting for justice in silence. It is the loneliest thing in the world. Every morning I woke up in Auntie Patience's spare room, I had to choose again to keep going. I had to choose not to collapse, not because I was not in pain, but because Chisom and Emmanuel were in that house, sleeping without their mother, and pain was a luxury I could not afford yet. I hired a lawyer. Her name was Mrs. Ado B. Okonkwo, and someone at the police station gave me her number. She was a small woman with very large glasses and the kind of calm voice that makes you feel like you are already winning. When I laid out every document, every email, every photograph I had taken of the shaving ceremony, because yes, I had found the videos some neighbors had posted and I had screenshots of all of them, Mrs. Okonkwo sat back in her chair and said, "Mrs. Eke, they made a very serious mistake when they chose you." She began the legal process to reclaim the property under joint ownership rights. She also filed for emergency custody of my children, citing the unlawful separation of minors from a living, legally recognized parent. But I was not waiting for court dates alone. Victor's doctor, a kind man named Dr. Farouk, who had treated our family for years, agreed to speak with me privately. I told him what I had found in the emails. I told him about Emmanuel's pressure over the land. I told him that Victor had been healthy in my eyes, but had complained of unusual tiredness in the months before he died, which I had assumed was stress. Dr. Farouk was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "There was a medication found in Victor's blood during the post-mortem. We noted it, but at the time, the family confirmed he was taking supplements for blood pressure. We had no reason to suspect otherwise." I asked him the name of the medication. He told me. I went home and searched it. It was a blood pressure drug, but when taken by someone who did not have a blood pressure condition, and especially when taken in high doses, it could cause the heart to fail under stress. My husband had never had a blood pressure problem in his life. I want you to understand what that moment felt like. I was sitting on the edge of a borrowed bed in a small room, and I was reading words on a screen that were telling me that my husband had been murdered, that the man who sang off-key in the kitchen and always forgot to replace the toilet roll and called me Justy when he was in a good mood, that man had been taken from me deliberately. And his own brother had sat in his chair and eaten my food and called me a killer. I did not scream. I did not cry. I opened a new document on the tablet and I began to write everything down. Every name, every date, Every piece of evidence. I wrote it as clearly as a woman who is preparing a case, because that is exactly what I was doing. I contacted a journalist next, a young woman who ran a popular news blog that many people in our city followed. I had seen her cover stories about property fraud and family abuse before, and she had a reputation for being fearless. I sent her a message through the blog's contact form and said only, "I have a story about injustice, murder, and stolen property. I have evidence. Are you interested?" She replied within an hour. Meanwhile, Emmanuel had begun the process of selling the industrial land, the same land Victor had refused to release. He had forged a signature on a transfer document. I know this because Mrs. Okonkwo had placed a legal notice on all the properties, and when Emmanuel tried to register the sale, the land registry flagged it. He didn't know yet that I was the one who had put that flag there. He was still walking around like a man who had won. He wore Victor's watch to church on Sunday. Someone told me this. That detail made something cold and final settle in my chest. Fine, let him enjoy it. The ending was coming. The day everything broke open was a Wednesday. Mrs. Okonkwo had been working with the police investigator, the woman officer who had taken my report that first week. That officer, whose name was Inspector Nkechieze, had quietly reopened the inquiry into Victor's death based on the medication evidence I had provided. She had contacted the hospital, obtained the original post-mortem samples, and sent them for independent toxicology testing. The results confirmed it. The dosage of medication found in Victor's blood was 4 times the therapeutic level. It had not been self-administered. Someone had been giving it to him steadily, mixed into something he consumed regularly over a period of weeks. Victor's evening tea. The same tea he drank every night before bed. The tea that was sometimes prepared by the house girl, a young girl Emmanuel had recommended they hire for us just 3 months before Victor died. When Inspector Eze brought that girl in for questioning, she broke down within the first 20 minutes and told them everything. Emmanuel had paid her. He had given her the medication in a small unlabeled bottle and told her to add a small amount to Victor's tea every evening. He had told her it was a health supplement that Victor was too stubborn to take himself. That girl was 18 years old. She had not understood what she was doing. She thought she was helping. Emmanuel was arrested on a Thursday morning at the office of the businessman he was meeting to finalize the land sale. Inspector Eze did not go quietly. She went with 4 officers, and she went at a time when the office was full of people. Emmanuel was handcuffed in front of a room full of men who had respected him, and he was walked out to a waiting vehicle while every person in that building watched. I was not there. I heard about it from Auntie Patience, who called me twice to make sure I was hearing every detail. Gloria, Emmanuel's wife, the woman who wore my gold chain to dinner, she disappeared the same day. She packed bags and left their home with the children before the news had even fully spread. I understood. She had known. Perhaps not everything, but enough. And now she was running from what was coming. Victor's mother, Mama Eke, came to Auntie Patience's house 2 days later. She came alone, without any of the family members who usually surrounded her. She looked old. She looked small in a way she had not looked before. She stood at the door, and when I opened it, she could not hold my gaze. She said, "Justina." I said, "Mama." She said, "I did not know he would go that far. I swear it. I did not know." I looked at this woman, the woman who looked away when they held me down and shaved my head, who said nothing when they took my children, who sat in the corner and let her son destroy me. And I felt something move through me that was not quite forgiveness and not quite rage. It was something quieter than both. I said, "You looked away, Mama. That is its own kind of knowing." She began to cry. I let her cry. Then I said, "My children need their grandmother. That will not change. But what you allowed will not be forgotten either. You will have to live with that." She nodded. She left. My children came home on a Friday.
The court had granted emergency custody the day Emmanuel was arrested, and Inspector Eze personally accompanied the welfare officer who collected Chisom and Emeka from the Eke family compound. My daughter ran to me from the gate. She was faster than I had ever seen a 7-year-old move. She hit my body like a small storm, and I held her so tightly I felt her heart beat against mine. Emeka was more careful. He was 10 and he had been trying to be strong in that house in the way that first sons try to be strong when they feel their family is under attack. He walked to me, and when he reached me, he buried his face in my neck and finally let himself cry. I held both of them in the middle of that road, and I did not care who was watching. The journalist published the full story 2 weeks later. She had photographs, documents, Inspector Eze's official statement, and a detailed timeline of everything, from Victor's death to the forged land papers to the arrest. The story spread across every platform. People shared it everywhere. Those videos of my public humiliation, of my shaved head and my tears were now being watched alongside the footage of Emmanuel in handcuffs. And the contrast was so sharp and so complete that even strangers who did not know us felt the justice of it. Emmanuel was charged with conspiracy to commit murder, forgery, and property fraud. His trial took 14 months. He was convicted on all counts. The properties were restored to me, all of them. The land in the industrial area, which was now worth 3 times what it had been worth when Victor died, came back into my name. And Mrs. Okonkwo stood beside me in the land registry office when I signed the papers. And she said, without any particular expression, they really should have left you alone.
I laughed. It was the first real laugh I had laughed in a very long time. I rebuilt. It was not easy, and I will not pretend it was. There were nights when I missed Victor so deeply that it felt like trying to breathe underwater. There were mornings when I had to talk myself out of bed. There were moments when Chisom asked about her father, and I had to answer honestly, in a way a child could hold, that her father had been taken from us by someone who was supposed to love him. But I rebuilt. I hired good people to run the business. I enrolled Emeka in the school he had always wanted to attend. Chisom started dance classes, and she is, to this day, the most dramatic dancer I have ever seen, full of fire, just like her mother. I cut my hair low, not because anyone forced me, because I chose it. Because that head of mine had been touched without my permission. And now every time I looked in the mirror and saw those clean lines, I remembered that I had taken back what was mine. People in that neighborhood who had watched them shave my head and said nothing, some of them came to apologize later. Some I accepted, some I did not. I have learned that forgiveness is something you do for yourself, not a gift you owe anyone. Mama Eke visits the children on Saturdays. We do not hug when she arrives. We do not pretend that nothing happened. But she sits at the table and she tells my children stories about their father, and that much I can give her. Victor loved his mother. I will not erase that. As for Gloria, Emmanuel's wife, she eventually settled somewhere else in the city. She sent me a message once through an intermediary asking if there was anything she could do. I thought about it for a long time. Then I replied, raise your children to be better than their father. She never responded. I don't know if she took it as an insult or a prayer. Honestly, it was both. And Emmanuel sits in a cell right now, knowing that everything he destroyed his brother to possess has been handed back to that brother's wife. The land he killed for, the house he seized, the business he planned to absorb, all of it in my name, under my management, growing every year. There is a line I heard somewhere that stayed with me. The grave they dig for you sometimes becomes their own foundation. Victor's grave is clean and tended. I go there with the children every Sunday after church. Emeka places fresh flowers. Chisom talks to her father like he can hear her. And maybe he can. I don't know.
I hope so. I stand there every Sunday and I say the same thing quietly before we leave. I kept what we built. I kept your children safe. I did not let them win. That is my story. Not a story of a woman who was destroyed. A story of a woman who was nearly destroyed and chose not to be. My name is Justina Ike. I was a widow at 38 years old. I was humiliated, accused, stripped, and discarded by people who thought grief would make me powerless. They were wrong. And they found out. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is the kind of story we tell here. Real, emotional, true.